At the reading of the will, my uncle laughed. He always said I was his favorite. Of course I get the house. My cousin winked. And we get the lake property, right? My dad just sat there, silent. They all turned to me and said, "You didn't even visit him in the hospital." I nodded, then slid a USB drive across the table and said, "That's funny, because he recorded something before he passed away and he asked me to play it for you all." I, 32M, sat at the mahogany table in the lawyer's office, watching my uncle lean back in his chair like he owned the place. In a way, he thought he did. The lawyer hadn't even finished reading the will yet, but my uncle was already laughing, making jokes about how Grandpa always said he was the favorite, how the house was obviously his. My cousin next to him was grinning too, asking about the lake property with this cocky wink that made my stomach turn. My dad sat across from me, staring at his hands. He hadn't said a word since we arrived. The silence from him hurt more than anything my uncle was saying. Then they all turned to look at me. My uncle's smile faded into something uglier. He reminded everyone that I hadn't even visited Grandpa in the hospital during his final weeks. My cousin nodded along, adding that I'd been too busy with my own life to care about family. Even my aunt, who'd been quiet until then, gave me this disappointed look that felt like a knife. I just nodded. Let them think what they wanted. I reached into my bag and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the polished table. I told them it was funny they brought that up, because Grandpa had recorded something before he passed, and he specifically asked me to play it for everyone at the reading of the will. The room went quiet. My uncle's face changed, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. The lawyer looked at me, then at the USB drive, asking if this was part of the estate documents. I said it was exactly what Grandpa wanted. My uncle tried to laugh it off, saying Grandpa probably recorded some sentimental message, maybe thanking him for all the years of support. My cousin was already making jokes about inheritance taxes, but I could see my dad's head lift slightly, his eyes meeting mine for the first time that day. The lawyer took the USB drive and plugged it into his laptop, connecting it to the screen on the wall. Everyone turned to watch. The screen flickered, then Grandpa's face appeared. He looked tired, sitting in his hospital bed, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He introduced himself, stated the date, 3 weeks before he died, and said he was of sound mind and wanted to set some things straight. My uncle shifted in his seat. The smugness was gone. Grandpa started talking about his life, about building his business from nothing, about the values he tried to instill in his children. Then his tone changed. He said he'd spent the last year watching his family very carefully, seeing who people really were when they thought no one important was looking. He talked about my uncle first, how my uncle had been calling him every week for the past 5 years, but only after Grandpa's business sold for a significant amount. Before that, the calls came maybe twice a year. Grandpa mentioned specific instances, times when my uncle promised to visit but never showed, times when he asked for money and disappeared afterward. He brought up the time my uncle borrowed $50,000 for a business opportunity and never paid it back, never even acknowledged it again. My uncle's face was red now. He tried to interrupt, but the lawyer held up his hand. This was a legal document. Everyone needed to hear it. Grandpa moved on to my cousin. He talked about how my cousin had brought his kids to visit exactly 4 times in 10 years, and each visit ended with requests for money or property. He mentioned the lake house specifically, how my cousin had asked about it repeatedly, talking about his plans for it, measuring rooms, even consulting contractors, all while Grandpa was still alive and living there part-time. My cousin wasn't grinning anymore. His wife next to him looked like she wanted to disappear. Then Grandpa talked about my dad. His voice softened. He said my dad was the most decent of his children, the one who never asked for anything, who called just to talk, who helped with repairs and errands without being asked. But he also said my dad was too passive, too willing to let his brothers walk over him, too afraid of conflict to stand up for what was right. Grandpa said he loved my dad, but he was disappointed that my dad never found his backbone. My dad's eyes were wet. He didn't look away from the screen. Finally, Grandpa turned his attention to me. He said I was the only one who visited him in the hospital, but not in the way everyone thought. He explained that I'd been coming late at night, after visiting hours, because I worked double shifts and it was the only time I could make it. I'd bribed the night nurses with coffee and donuts so they'd let me in. We'd sit together for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching old movies on his iPad. My throat felt tight. Those nights felt private, sacred. I hadn't told anyone because it wasn't anyone's business. Grandpa was dying, and I wanted to be there. Simple as that. Grandpa said I never asked him for anything. Not money, not property, not favors. I just showed up. And during those long nights, he told me everything. About his disappointments, his regrets, his anger at watching his children circle him like vultures. He said he'd made up his mind about what to do with his estate, and he'd asked me to be the executor, to make sure his wishes were carried out exactly as he intended. The video ended. The room was dead silent. The lawyer cleared his throat and went back to the will. The house, the one my uncle was so sure about, was going to a local charity that helped homeless veterans. Grandpa had been a veteran himself, something my uncle always forgot to mention when he told stories about the family. The lake property went to my dad, with a stipulation that he couldn't sell it for at least 10 years. Grandpa wanted him to have a place to retreat, to find peace, to maybe learn to stand up for himself. My uncle got a single dollar, literally $1, with a note in the will stating it was proof he hadn't been forgotten, just deemed unworthy of more. My cousin got nothing. The will specifically stated that his request for property while Grandpa was alive demonstrated exactly the kind of character that deserved no reward. The investment accounts, the stocks, the remaining cash assets, those were split between me and my dad, 60-40. The will stated I'd earned it by being present when it mattered, by treating Grandpa like a person instead of a bank account. My uncle exploded. He started yelling about contesting the will, about undue influence, about how I'd manipulated a dying old man. The lawyer calmly informed him that the video recording, combined with the detailed documentation of every interaction over the past 5 years, made any contest extremely unlikely to succeed. Grandpa had been thorough. He'd kept records of every phone call, every visit, every request for money. He'd documented everything. My cousin tried a different approach, suggesting we could work something out as a family, that Grandpa wouldn't have wanted us to fight. I finally spoke up, reminding him that Grandpa was explicit about what he wanted, and it was recorded for everyone to see. There was nothing to work out. My aunt started crying, saying this would tear the family apart. My dad, for the first time in my life, told her the family had been torn apart long before today. It just took Grandpa's death for everyone to see it clearly. The meeting ended badly. My uncle stormed out, threatening lawsuits. My cousin followed, his wife shooting me a look that could kill. My aunt left in tears, telling my dad he should be ashamed for not defending his brothers. My dad and I sat in the parking lot afterward, neither of us saying anything for a long time. Finally, he thanked me for being there for Grandpa. He said he should have been stronger, should have stood up to his brothers years ago. I told him Grandpa understood, that he never blamed him for being kind. There was a difference between being weak and being good, and Dad was just good. He asked me what I was going to do with my inheritance. I said I hadn't thought about it much. The money was nice, but it wasn't why I'd spent those nights with Grandpa. I just wanted him to know someone cared about him as a person, not as an ATM. Dad nodded, and for the first time in years, he smiled. He said Grandpa would be proud of me. Then he said he was proud of me too. Update 1. 3 days after the will reading, my uncle made good on his threat. He filed a contest, claiming undue influence and diminished capacity. His lawyer sent a formal letter demanding mediation, suggesting that I'd isolated Grandpa and manipulated him into changing his will. The letter was full of legal language designed to sound intimidating, but the lawyer handling Grandpa's estate wasn't worried. He said these contests almost never succeeded, especially with video evidence and documentation. My cousin took a different route. He started a whisper campaign among extended family members, telling anyone who would listen that I'd stolen their inheritance, that I'd turned Grandpa against his own children. Suddenly, I was getting calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, some asking for my side of the story, others outright accusing me of being manipulative and greedy. I didn't engage. Grandpa had warned me this would happen. During one of our late-night hospital visits, he'd told me that people who feel entitled to things they didn't earn will always find someone else to blame. He said the truth didn't matter to them as much as their narrative did. But the hardest part was watching what it did to my dad. His brothers stopped speaking to him entirely. Family gatherings he used to attend became hostile territory. My aunt called him repeatedly, begging him to talk sense into me, to convince me to split the inheritance more evenly. She said it was tearing the family apart, and he had a responsibility to fix it. My dad finally told her that the family had been broken long before Grandpa died, and pretending otherwise was exhausting. She hung up on him. The legal contest dragged on for 2 months. My uncle's lawyer deposed me, asking detailed questions about my relationship with Grandpa, about the timing of my visits, about whether I'd ever discussed the will with him. I answered honestly. Yes, Grandpa and I had talked about his estate, but only because he brought it up. He'd wanted someone to know his reasoning, to understand why he was making the choices he was making. I never asked for anything, never suggested he leave me money. I was just there to listen. The lawyer tried to make something sinister out of the late-night visits, suggesting they were secretive and manipulative. I explained that I worked 2 jobs, one ending at midnight, the other starting at 6 in the morning. The night shift at the hospital was the only time I could visit. The nurses could confirm it. Several of them wrote statements supporting my account. My uncle's case fell apart during his own deposition. When asked about his visits with Grandpa over the past 5 years, he couldn't provide specific dates or details. He claimed he'd visited regularly, but had no proof. His phone records showed minimal contact. When confronted with Grandpa's meticulous records, showing exactly when my uncle called and what was discussed, he became defensive and angry. It didn't look good. The judge reviewed the video recording, the documentation, and the depositions. She dismissed the contest, ruling that Grandpa had clearly been of sound mind and that his wishes were unambiguous. She also ordered my uncle to pay the legal fees, stating that the contest was frivolous and appeared to be motivated by greed rather than legitimate concern. My uncle didn't take it well. He sent me a text message saying I'd destroyed the family and that I'd have to live with that guilt. I blocked his number. Update 2. 6 months after the will reading, things started to settle into a new normal. My dad and I weren't invited to family events anymore, but honestly, that felt like a relief more than a loss. The people who'd sided with my uncle weren't people I wanted in my life anyway. My dad did something I never expected. He started therapy. He said watching Grandpa's video had made him realize how much of his life he'd spent avoiding conflict, trying to keep peace at the expense of his own dignity. He told me he didn't want to live like that anymore. He wanted to be someone his father could be proud of, even if it was too late for Grandpa to see it. I used part of my inheritance to pay off my debts and quit one of my jobs. For the first time in years, I wasn't working myself into exhaustion. I started taking classes, thinking about going back to school. Grandpa had always said education was the one thing no one could take from you. The rest of the money I invested, following Grandpa's advice from our hospital conversations. He'd been good with money, smart about long-term planning. I wasn't trying to get rich. I just wanted security, stability, the kind of foundation Grandpa had built for himself. My dad started spending weekends at the lake house. He invited me up a few times, and we'd sit on the dock, fishing and talking about nothing important. He seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. He told me he'd been carrying his brother's expectations his whole life, always trying to be the peacemaker, the reasonable one. Now that they'd cut him off, he realized he didn't miss them. He missed the idea of them, the fantasy of a close family, but not the reality of who they actually were. One weekend, Dad told me he'd started seeing someone. A woman he'd met at a community event, someone with no connection to our family drama. He seemed nervous telling me, like I might disapprove. I told him Grandpa would have been happy for him. Dad smiled and said he thought so too. My cousin's financial situation apparently deteriorated. I heard through the family grapevine that he'd been counting on that inheritance to cover some bad investments. Without it, things got difficult. Part of me felt bad, but a larger part remembered how he'd measured rooms in the lake house while Grandpa was still alive, already planning renovations. He'd never seen it as Grandpa's home, just as property, as asset, as something he deserved. My uncle moved to a smaller house. I didn't feel good about that either, but I also remembered the $50,000 he'd borrowed and never repaid, the promises he'd made and broken, the way he'd laughed at that conference table, so certain of his inheritance. Grandpa's estate hadn't made him poor. It had just failed to make him rich, and there was a difference. I got a call from one of the nurses who'd worked nights at the hospital. She'd found something in the staff room, a thank you card Grandpa had written but never sent. It was addressed to the nursing staff, thanking them for letting me visit after hours, saying it meant more to him than they could know. The nurse thought I should have it. I cried reading it, sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot. The card had a postscript. Grandpa had written that he knew his family would be angry when they learned the truth about the will, but he hoped I wouldn't let their anger make me doubt myself. He wrote that doing the right thing often made you unpopular, but that didn't make it less right. He said he was proud of me for showing up when no one else did, and that was worth more than any inheritance. I kept the card in my desk drawer. On bad days, when the guilt crept in, because some part of me still felt guilty, still wondered if I should have done more to keep the family together, I took it out and read it. Update 3. A year after Grandpa's death, my dad and I established a scholarship in his name at the local community college. We focused it on non-traditional students, people returning to school after years away, people working multiple jobs, people who needed a second chance. It felt right. Grandpa had built his business while taking night classes. He understood what it meant to fight for education while surviving on no sleep and determination. My uncle sent a letter through his lawyer, asking to be included in the scholarship foundation. He wanted his name listed as a co-founder, said it would help with his reputation in the community. The lawyer advised us that we had no obligation to include him. We declined. The scholarship was about Grandpa's values, and those values didn't include rewarding people for showing up only when there was credit to claim. My cousin reached out directly, sending me a long email explaining his financial troubles and asking for a loan. He said we were still family, despite everything, and family helped each other. He needed $30,000 to avoid foreclosure. He promised to pay it back with interest. I discussed it with my dad. He said it was my decision, but he reminded me of the $50,000 Grandpa had loaned his brother, money that was never repaid or even acknowledged. He said some people saw kindness as weakness, generosity as opportunity. They didn't learn from consequences because they never believed consequences applied to them. I didn't send the money. I did send a reply suggesting he contact the financial counseling service the scholarship fund had partnered with. They offered free advice for people in difficult situations. He never responded. The family split became permanent. Holiday cards stopped coming. The few relatives who tried to stay neutral eventually picked sides, usually siding with my uncle because it was easier than standing alone. My dad and I became the family outcasts, the ones who'd chosen money over relationships. But we knew the truth. We hadn't chosen money. We'd chosen to honor a dying man's wishes, to respect his right to distribute his own property as he saw fit. The fact that his wishes reflected years of observation, of disappointment, of watching his children reveal their true characters, that wasn't our fault. I still thought about those nights in the hospital sometimes. The quiet conversations, the old movies playing on a small screen, the way Grandpa's hand felt fragile in mine. He'd told me stories about his childhood, about the depression, about building something from nothing. He'd asked me about my dreams, my fears, my hopes for the future. We'd talked about everything and nothing. He'd also told me that true character revealed itself in small moments, in choices people made when they thought no one important was watching. He said you could learn everything you needed to know about a person by watching how they treated others when there was nothing to gain from kindness. I visited Grandpa's grave sometimes, usually early in the morning when no one else was around. I'd tell him about the scholarship, about Dad getting stronger, about the life I was building. I'd thank him for seeing me, for recognizing that showing up mattered even when no one else knew about it. My dad started bringing his girlfriend to these visits. She was good for him, straightforward, honest, with no patience for family politics or artificial peacekeeping. She told him once that his brothers had done him a favor by cutting him off. They'd freed him from the obligation of pretending, from the exhausting work of maintaining relationships with people who didn't respect him. The scholarship gave out its first award 10 months after we established it. A single mother, 42 years old, working as a night shift janitor while trying to get her nursing degree. She cried when we told her. She said she'd been about to drop out because she couldn't afford childcare and tuition both. The scholarship changed everything for her. Grandpa would have loved her story. He would have seen himself in her determination, her refusal to give up despite the odds. That's what the inheritance was really about, I realized. Not the money itself, but what it represented, validation for people who did the hard work when no one was watching, who showed up when it would have been easier to walk away. My uncle eventually stopped his legal threats. His lawyer probably told him he was wasting money on a case he couldn't win. My cousin's social media went quiet for a while, then reappeared with posts about new beginnings and cutting toxic people out of his life. I never checked to see if I was the toxic people he meant. It didn't matter. I ran into my aunt at the grocery store once. She looked older, tired. She asked how I was doing, and I said I was fine. She said family was important, that I should think about reconciliation. I told her I'd honored Grandpa's wishes exactly as he'd asked me to, and I'd do it again without hesitation. She walked away without responding. The truth was simple, even if the situation wasn't. Grandpa had spent his life building something, and he'd earned the right to decide what happened to it. He'd watched his children carefully, measured their character, and made his choices accordingly. My only crime was respecting those choices, even when they made me unpopular. I'd learned something important from the whole experience. Being liked and being respected weren't the same thing. My uncle was probably still telling everyone who'd listened that I was greedy and manipulative. My cousin probably still believed he'd been wronged, that he deserved that lake property because he'd imagined himself owning it. But I could sleep at night knowing I'd done right by Grandpa. I'd shown up in his final weeks not because I wanted something, but because he was my grandfather and I loved him. The inheritance was never the point. The point was being present for someone who needed it, even when, especially when, no one else was. My dad told me once that Grandpa's video had changed his life. Not because of the inheritance, but because it showed him that someone had been paying attention, that his quiet decency had been seen and valued. He said he'd spent years feeling invisible in his own family, like his kindness was taken for granted. Grandpa's words proved that someone had noticed, someone had cared.